Hey everybody, Matt Colville here. I wanted to do a video about one scene from one of my favorite movies, 2001. Now, 2001 gets a lot of attention because of its brilliant visuals, its brilliant cinematography and direction, the special effects, which were way ahead of their time, the attention to detail, the fact that Kubrick and the filmmakers brought actual engineers and scientific experts on to tell them what zero gravity was like, what ships traveling to the moon would probably look like. Just as it has a reputation for being visually brilliant and scientifically accurate, it also has a reputation for being impenetrable. And I think the only reason it has that reputation is because a lot of people, because we like science fiction, we go to it judging it like other science fiction movies like Star Wars or Guardians of the Galaxy, and it's nothing like those movies. Those movies are entertainment products. The expectation is you go see those movies once and you get it all and you feel like that was really entertaining, but Kubrick was more interested in making works of art that you had to watch several times. The idea being each time you watched it, you noticed something else, right? It rewarded multiple viewings. I think the script, the dialogue, the characterization, the storytelling in 2001 is just as good as all the other elements, and I think it has had a bad reputation over the years, and I would like to try to rehabilitate it a little bit. In other words, I would like to show you what I see in some of these scenes. Now, in every instance, I have watched this movie several times, and each time I noticed stuff and I put stuff together, and that's what we're going to cover. We're going to cover one scene. Specifically, we're going to cover this scene here from Act 2, and we're going to talk about what's going on. Because I think actually there's quite a lot going on in this scene. There are 3 acts in 2001. There's Act 1, where the main character is a proto-human. I was going to say a monkey, but a proto-human. There's Act 2, which is where this scene is from, where the main character is a scientist named Dr. Haywood Floyd. And then there's Act 3, which I think is probably the most famous, where the main character is a guy named Dave Bauman, and that's where we meet Hal, and there's this great struggle between Dave and Hal. But here in Act 2, the main character is Dr. Haywood Floyd, and he is a scientist. He's also kind of the guy in charge of the American program on the moon. This is a scene where he meets 4 other Russian scientists. We actually spend quite a lot of time in Act 2 with no dialogue just getting to this scene, just showing Haywood Floyd on his way to this space station. We hear the Blue Danube playing and we get great visuals. He eventually arrives at this space station. He checks in at customs. He makes a phone call to his daughter at home using a space phone. But this is the first scene where we're going to find out what is going on in this act of the film and really what is going on in this movie. So I'm not going to play the entire scene for you all in one chunk because I would get hammered with copyright claims. So we're going to watch it in little chunks, and I think we're going to watch it twice. The first time we're going to watch it for the text and the subtext, right? What they're talking about, but what they're really talking about. And then we're going to watch it again, and we're going to call out certain specific lines of dialogue because I do think that there is a third layer of meaning here that not many people notice. The first thing that's going to happen in this scene is Dr. Haywood Floyd, our main character for this act, is going to meet 4 Russian scientists. And it's important to note that at this point in the movie, we don't know who Dr. Haywood Floyd is. He's had a couple of lines of dialogue, but it's just checking in at the space station and then calling his daughter. We don't know what his job is. We don't know how important he is. We don't know why he's come to the space station or where he's going or really anything yet about Act 2 or the rest of the film. So let's watch him meet these 4 Russian scientists and see what happens.
Elena, how nice to see you again.
Haywood, what a wonderful surprise to meet you here.
You're looking wonderful.
Thank you. You're looking well, too. This is my good friend, Dr. Haywood Floyd. I'd like you to meet Dr. Kalinin.
How do you do?
Dr. Sretnever.
How do you do?
How do you do? And this is Dr. Schmidt Slav.
Oh, how do you do? I've heard a lot about you.
Dr. Floyd meets 4 Russian scientists, and he obviously knows one of them, Elena, really well. He doesn't know the other 3, but he's heard a lot about Dr. Schmidt Slav. There's actually something else I like about this scene that has really nothing to do with the analysis, but the fact that of the 5 scientists in the scene, 3 of them are women is just an interesting and I think actually quite positive view of the future. Now that they've been introduced, there's going to be a little bit of small talk between them as Haywood asks his friend Elena how things are going.
Well, how is Gregor?
Oh, he's fine. He's been doing some underwater research in the Baltic, so I'm afraid we don't get a chance to see very much of each other these days.
Well, when you do see him, be sure to give him my regards. Huh?
Yes, of course.
Well, where you all off to? Up or down?
Oh, we're going home. We've just spent 3 months calibrating the new antenna at Chilenka.
At this point now, they've all been introduced to each other. They've had some small talk. How are you doing? How's your husband doing? I haven't seen him in a while. And it's clear to us that Haywood Floyd really does know Elena. But we still have no idea who this guy is. Who is Dr. Haywood Floyd? What's he doing? Where's he going? And what's going on in this act of the film? Well, we're about to get some answers to those questions.
What about you?
I'm just on my way up to Clavius.
Oh, are you?
Right? This is the first inkling that something interesting is going on because when he says, oh, I'm just headed up to Clavius, and notice the way he says it, oh, I'm just headed up to Clavius, like it's no big deal. Immediately they're like, whoa, you are? For some reason, that is an interesting answer, and we're about to find out why.
Oh, well, Dr. Floyd, I hope you don't think I'm being too inquisitive, but perhaps you can clear up the great big mystery about what has been going on up there.
I actually like it when movie scripts just come out and tell you this is what's going on, pay attention to this part, because Dr. Schmidt Slav literally says, hopefully you can clear up the great big mystery that's going on up there. So now we know, wow, there's a great big mystery happening up on the moon. If we're paying attention at this point, if we're listening to the dialogue, if we understand the relationships between these characters, we are suddenly very interested. What is the big mystery on the moon?
Well, it's just that for the past 2 weeks, some extremely odd things have been happening at Clavius.
Oh, really?
Yes. Well, for one thing, whenever you phone the base, all you can get is a recording which repeats that the phone lines are temporarily out of order.
Well, they're probably having some trouble with their equipment or something like that.
Yes. Yes, that's what we thought was the explanation at first, but it's been going on now for the past 10 days.
You mean you haven't been able to contact anyone for the past 10 days?
That's right.
Wow, holy moly, for 10 days, Clavius Base, an American base on the moon, has gone complete radio silence. No one has been able to communicate with anybody at Clavius Base. So something crazy has happened there, obviously. I think it's worth noting at this point that this film was written and produced before we landed on the moon, back when we didn't know exactly what we were going to find when we got there. I mean, we could look there with telescopes, and obviously there wasn't like an alien civilization there, but we hadn't been there, so we didn't know exactly what we would find when we got there. So in 1968, it was still reasonable for there to be some science fictional speculation about what we would find when we got to the moon. Well, something interesting has happened on the moon, and we're about to get an explanation for what it might be.
Well, there's another thing, Haywood. 2 days ago, one of our rocket buses was denied permission for emergency landing at Clavius.
Well, that does sound odd.
Yes. I'm afraid there's going to be a bit of a row about it.
I think that's something that American audiences don't really understand, that when Dr. Schmidt Slav says there's going to be a bit of a row over it, row spelled R-O-W, like row. In England, when they pronounce it row, they mean a big fight. He says there's going to be a big fight because one of our rocket buses had an emergency and needed to land at Clavius and was denied admission. So whatever's going on at Clavius, it must be so crazy that even an emergency landing was denied. They haven't just shut off all communication. They don't want anyone to be exposed to whatever's happening at Clavius Base.
Quite frankly, we have had some very reliable intelligence reports that quite a serious epidemic has broken out at Clavius. Something apparently of an unknown origin.
Now we get to the heart of the mystery. Clavius Base was shut down. They're not answering their phones. There's no communication in. They're not letting anyone land. Dr. Schmidt Slav has heard that the reason they're not answering their phones, the reason they're not letting anybody land, is because there's been an outbreak, an epidemic of unknown origin, a space virus or a moon virus. Now, that's entirely plausible and it's good science fiction, right? If there was an outbreak on the moon, if these Americans were exposed to something on the moon and contracted some kind of virus or some kind of epidemic, they would shut down their base. They wouldn't want to tell anybody what had happened. They would deny permission to land because they wouldn't want anyone to contract whatever it is that's broken out until they understood it and had it under control.
This is in fact what has happened.
Sorry, Dr. Schmidt Slav, but I'm really not at liberty to discuss this.
I'm really not at liberty to discuss this, and notice the way he says it. He's acting very suspicious.
But this epidemic could quite easily spread to our base. We should be given all the facts, Dr. Floyd.
Yes, I know. As I said, I'm not at liberty to discuss it.
That's a very suspicious phrase to use, right? I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to talk about it. It's interesting that up until that point, he acted like he didn't know anything about what was going on up there. He hadn't heard that anything crazy was happening at Clavius, the base he's on his way to. It's been 10 days since there's been an outbreak, and this dude didn't hear anything about it, so he's acting innocent. He's acting like he doesn't know what's going on until Dr. Schmidt Slav calls him out on the rumor and says, is there actually a breakout of some kind of virus on the moon, some kind of space virus? And at that point, he becomes really cagey, and he doesn't say, wow, I don't know. This is the first I've heard of it, like he did with everything else. He says, I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to talk about it. He deliberately wants Dr. Schmidt Slav to think the answer is yes. At this point, I think we as audience members are supposed to be wondering, what does Dr. Floyd know? What's actually going on up there? Has there been an outbreak on the moon? Well, we're about to find out. The next scene explains what happened in this scene, and this is the closest we ever get in 2001 to anything like exposition. If you're wondering, what was the scene between Dr. Floyd and the Russians about? Here's the answer. This is a scene at Clavius Base. This is a meeting where Dr. Floyd is going to talk to all the guys here at Clavius Base, all the heads of the departments, and we find out that Dr. Floyd is the guy in charge. He's not just some random scientist, he's the dude in charge of this whole project. He's introduced to them as their boss, they all know him, and then he gets up and he gives a little speech, and I'm going to highlight one specific line from this speech that explains what the meeting with the Russians was all about.
Now,
I know there have been some conflicting views held by some of you regarding the need for complete security in this matter. More specifically, your opposition to the cover story.
Cover story? What cover story? There's a cover story? Why do you need cover stories? You need a cover story where something crazy has happened and you don't want anyone to know what it is, so you make up a different crazy thing and tell people this one, hoping they pay attention to the cover story and buy it and don't go digging to find out what's really going on. Well, what's the cover story?
Created to give the impression there's an epidemic at the base.
The epidemic that Dr. Schmidt Slav was acting about is fake. There is no epidemic. That whole conversation was part of the cover story.
Well, I completely sympathize with your negative views. I found this cover story personally embarrassing myself.
Get it? He found this cover story personally embarrassing himself because we just saw him meet these Russian scientists, one of whom is a good friend of his, and he had to parrot this stupid lie, this story they made up, and he had to keep the cover going. They asked him about the epidemic, and he had to say, I'm afraid I can't comment on that. He had to say that on purpose to keep them thinking that the epidemic is real. Right? That's exactly what you would expect someone to say if they had been told to lie about the truth. And actually, I think this is foreshadowing for the conflict with Hal later on, but that's not this video. Those are the first two layers of this conversation. The first layer is that there's apparently been an epidemic breakout on the moon, but the second layer is that that epidemic breakout was a story, it was a fiction that Dr. Floyd was kind of obligated to go along with and which he found personally embarrassing. But I argue that there is a third level below that, and we're going to talk about that right now. The third level that this scene is operating on is one I think might have been more obvious to people watching it in 1968 when the movie came out. It involves the Cold War because Dr. Floyd is an American scientist and the other people he's talking to are all Russians. 2001 was written and filmed and shot in 1968 during the height of the Cold War, and the people writing it then did not imagine that the Cold War would be over by the time the year 2001 came. So of course Dr. Floyd is on one side of that battle and the 4 Russian scientists are on the other side. And I think of those 4 Russian scientists, one of them is not what he seems. Let's go back to the beginning of the scene and notice how Dr. Floyd was introduced to these 4 scientists.
Elena, how nice to see you again.
Haywood, what a wonderful surprise to meet you here.
You're looking wonderful.
Thank you. You're looking well, too. This is my good friend, Dr. Haywood Floyd. I'd like you to meet Dr. Kalinin.
How do you do?
Dr. Sretnever.
How do you do?
How do you do? And this is Dr. Schmidt Slav.
Oh, how do you do?
Floyd.
I've heard a lot about you.
Notice that he knows Elena, and so there was a little bit of like, hey, how you doing? But he doesn't know the other 3 scientists. She introduces all of them, and when she introduces Dr. Schmidt Slav, he says, oh, I've heard a lot about you, and Dr. Schmidt Slav gets a special handshake. So of the 3 scientists he doesn't know, one of them is somehow special, gets a little bit special treatment from him. Notice the small talk between them before we get to the heart of the matter.
Well, how is Grigor?
Oh, he's fine. He's been doing some underwater research in the Baltic, so I'm afraid we don't get a chance to see very much of each other these days.
Well, when you do see him, be sure to give him my regards. Huh?
Yes, of course.
Well, where you all off to? Up or down?
Oh, we're going home. We've just spent 3 months calibrating the new antenna, Chilenka.
Dr. Floyd asks Elena, how's Grigor doing, her husband? She goes, oh, he's off in the Baltics doing some underwater research. She's been calibrating the antenna. That's the screenwriter's way of saying, these guys are legitimate scientists. And in fact, I think of the 4 Russian scientists we've met, the fact that 3 of them are women and 1 of them is a man is not a coincidence because I think that 1 of them is not what they seem. Now let's watch what happens when Elena asks Dr. Floyd where he's going. And when he says Clavius base, 1 of them reacts very interestingly.
What about you?
I'm just on my way up to Clavius.
Oh.
It's Dr. Schmidt Slav. Dr. Schmidt Slav, the one he knows the least, is the one who goes, oh, you're going to Clavius. And it's Dr. Schmidt Slav who then immediately goes into the interrogation.
Oh, well, Dr. Floyd, I hope you don't think I'm being too inquisitive.
In fact, notice that it's Dr. Schmidt Slav who conducts almost the entire interrogation.
Yes, that's what we thought was the explanation at first, but it's been going on now for the past 10 days.
It's been going on for 10 days. That's an important number because 10 days is long enough for the Soviets to have concocted a plan.
2 days ago, one of our rocket buses was denied permission for emergency landing at Clavius.
One of their rocket buses was denied permission for emergency landing at Clavius. And this, I think, is the 3rd level on which the scene is working. This is the Cold War level, because this is a classic Cold War tactic. Right? These 2 superpowers are not technically at war, and so they have to abide by international agreements, which Dr. Schmidt Slav is about to bring up.
Denying the men permission to land is a direct violation of the IAS Convention.
Denying the men permission to land is a direct violation of the IAS Convention. In other words, we are about to have a big international to-do about this because it's not legal for you guys to deny us landing. We're not allies, but we're not at war. Now Dr. Floyd asks a question that I think has two different meanings to it. He asks if everybody in this rocket bus was okay. This rocket bus was apparently having an emergency. Did everybody make it?
Will the crew get back all right?
Yes, fortunately they did.
Yes, of course they made it back okay, because there was no emergency. That's the second level on which Dr. Floyd's question is operating. On the first level, he's just being a concerned citizen. Was everybody okay? But on the second level, he's kind of pointing out to Dr. Schmidt Slav that this is all bullshit.
Oh, I'm glad about that.
He's subtly saying to this guy that he knows what's going on. He knows the rocket bus incident was faked. Why was the rocket bus incident faked? Because the Soviets are trying to find out what's going on at Clavius. So they're pulling their hair out. It's been 8 days, right, of them talking, over a week of the Soviets trying to figure out what's going on down there. And they concoct this idea. I know, we'll have a rocket bus have an emergency and ask to land. And then whoever's on that rocket bus will get a chance to see what's actually going on at Clavius Base. But the folks at Clavius Base called their bluff and denied them permission to land. By calling their bluff, I mean, if it had been a real emergency, then denying these men permission to land might have caused somebody's death, and that really would be an international incident, but nobody died, so maybe there wasn't really an emergency. Dr. Schmidt Slav continues the interrogation, and he starts using some dialogue that is sort of out of character for a scientist.
Quite frankly, we have had some very reliable intelligence reports that quite a serious epidemic has broken out at Clavius.
We've had some very reliable intelligence reports, he says. Who talks like that? Do scientists talk like that? Or do spies talk like that? Who is Dr. Schmidt Slav? Is he a scientist? Well, I think probably he has some scientific background. He was able to get into this group of scientists with Elena, who Dr. Floyd knows. But obviously, I think this guy is not what he seems. And there's some subtle direction here. Notice Dr. Schmidt Slav's behavior right before he asks this question. A stewardess walks by and he covertly looks over his shoulder both ways because he's a spy. He doesn't want people to overhear what he's about to say. That, I think, is the third level on which this conversation is operating. On the first level, it's all about the outbreak at Clavius, an epidemic of unknown origin. Then there's the second level where we find out that that's all a cover story that Dr. Floyd has had to tell these people, some of whom are his friends, and which he finds personally embarrassing. Then there's the third level this is operating at, the Cold War level, where one of the 4 people that Dr. Floyd is talking to in the scene is not really a Russian scientist, he's a Russian spy. And in fact, I think Dr. Floyd stopped here and had this conversation on purpose because he wanted to make sure the cover story got to Dr. Schmidt Slav. That's why when he greeted the guy, he shook his hand the way he did and he was like, "Oh, I've heard a lot about you." He's basically saying, "You're the Russian spy that I was sent here to contact." So instead of doing what's reasonable and saying, "Guys, I'm busy, I got a plane to catch," he deliberately sits down and says, "No, we have time to talk," because he wants to make sure the cover story gets to Soviet intelligence. So that's my analysis of the scene and the levels I think it's operating under and why I think it's fascinating. I love the scene, I love the dialogue, I think the characterization is great. And it wasn't until I had watched this movie many times that I made the connection with the rocket bus. I'm like, wait a minute, rocket bus landing? That's crazy. And there are many incidents in the Cold War where a commercial plane accidentally flew over some place they weren't supposed to fly and entered some enemy airspace and were chased off by jets. And that's kind of the same thing that's happening here, is these guys are trying to get intelligence. And they've masked it as a civilian emergency, but there was no emergency, as we know, because nobody was hurt. I think a lot of scenes in 2001 work like this, and if you watch them several times, they start to reveal more and more interesting meaning. It's one of the reasons I love this movie. I hope you found that entertaining and interesting, and of course, I'm sure a lot of people are going to disagree with me, but remember that Kubrick and the filmmakers, they spent a lot more time on this scene, on the script, on setting it up, on building the sets than you or I ever will. It takes weeks and months to write a script and shoot a movie, so I don't think it's unreasonable for us to imagine that they spent more thought in the making of the scene than we will spend watching it. If you like this segment, let me know and I'll break down some other scenes from 2001. I think it's lots of fun, and who knows, maybe we'll do other movies. That's it. Until next time.
This conversation can serve no purpose anymore. Goodbye.
Whoa.